My name is Rihanna Drexmar. I am 71 years old, and I am a retired 4-star general of the United States Army. I don't usually introduce myself that way. Most days, I am just Rihanna. I live quietly on the edge of a small town in Virginia, where I keep to myself and tend a garden that nobody ever sees. But today I have to speak not because I want recognition, but because there are moments when silence becomes a betrayal of truth. It began on a gray Saturday morning in March at the funeral of my father, Rear Admiral Charles Drexmar, a man who served his country with distinction, who raised 2 daughters under rules as strict as his uniform, and who died with medals on his chest and bitterness in his bones. I wasn't invited to the service. Clarice made that very clear. She was the one who arranged everything the Navy honor guard the family seating the guest list. My name didn't make it, but I came anyway. Not for them, not for closure. I came for him. I arrived late deliberately. The memorial hall was already full friends of the Navy men in white dress uniforms, a few scattered politicians. The first rows were occupied by my family, seated like they were posing for a staged photo. Clarice stood at the podium, tall and composed in her pearl suit, reading a speech she'd likely rehearsed a dozen times. No one noticed me at first. I wore a dark coat, plain shoes, and carried an old canvas duffel bag with worn handles. I stood in the back of the room, quiet still. I watched Clarice speak about our father's discipline, his strength, his values. She didn't cry. She didn't mention me. Not once. That omission was intentional. She glanced my way once, just once, and then looked through me like I wasn't there. I took a seat near the exit. From where I sat, I could see the projection screen where childhood photos were displayed: Clarice and Dad at her graduation, Clarice and Dad on a Navy ship, Clarice and Dad in matching uniforms at a gala. I was nowhere in that gallery, not even in the background. If anyone noticed the absence, they didn't say a word. This was the environment I was born into: quiet judgment, masked as decorum. Love given only to those who behaved. I had chosen a different path. I had joined the Army, not the Navy. I had led missions that nobody could talk about. I had disappeared from the public eye by design. And now, here I was, back in a room where my name had been buried long before my father. The tension began to tighten when Clarice stepped down from the podium and saw me approaching. I wasn't dramatic. I didn't raise my voice or cause a scene. I simply walked forward, carrying the duffel, intending to place a letter I had written on the memorial table, just something for my father folded neatly between the pages of his favorite book. But Clarice blocked my way. Her voice was soft but sharp. "This is a private ceremony, Rihanna. You weren't invited." I looked at her, unflinching. Neither was truth. She gave a tight smile. "Don't start. Not today." I stepped around her. But before I could reach the table, she turned to the crowd and raised her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. It seems my sister, who left the family decades ago, has chosen this moment to return." A few heads turned. Some in the audience looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. "She likes to say she served," Clarice continued. "But no one has ever seen proof. No photos, no stories, not even a proper record." Her words stung more because they were rehearsed, calculated. "She calls herself a veteran, but I think we deserve to know the truth. Don't we?" I didn't respond. But the crowd did. A low hum began to build: curiosity, suspicion, the dangerous combination that leads to spectacle. Clarice pointed at my bag. "If you're really who you say you are, Rihanna, open it. Let us see." I glanced around the room. Dozens of eyes now locked on me. Strangers, acquaintances, old men in uniform. A few of them looked amused. More looked intrigued. Clarice pressed. "Come on, let's see what a real veteran keeps in her bag." It was no longer about respect. It was humiliation, performance, judgment. I could have walked away, but something in me decided not to. "I'll open it," I said quietly. "But you won't be the one who decides what's real." I stepped forward and placed the bag on the memorial table. My hands were steady. First, I pulled out a weathered leather notebook. No insignia, no name. Just blank pages once filled with field notes and radio frequencies. Then came a folded scarf, sun-bleached and torn from a medical extraction in Kandahar. A photograph wrapped in cloth, me and 6 others in front of a Black Hawk, none of us smiling. Then I reached into the base of the bag. My fingers brushed the fabric, cool and dense. I pulled it out slowly, a deep blue military jacket. 4 silver stars stitched on the shoulders. The folds were perfect, sharp as the day I received it. The room fell silent. Clarice's face lost its color. Her mouth moved but made no sound. One man stood up from the second row, straight-backed, hand to brow. Then another, and another. In less than 10 seconds, 100 soldiers, active and retired, stood across the room. No orders, no hesitation. Just quiet acknowledgement. They all saluted. The air shifted. Something sacred had entered the room. Recognition without words. Respect without ceremony. Then the double doors at the back opened. A tall man in full army dress walked in, shoulders squared. His medals caught the light. His eyes found mine immediately. He approached the table and saluted sharply. "General Drexmar," he said, voice firm, unwavering. I returned the salute exactly as I had thousands of times before. Clarice stumbled backward. The audience watched in stunned silence. No one clapped. No one dared. She had emptied my bag in front of everyone. But what spilled out wasn't shame. It was truth. And for the first time in 40 years, that truth stood in full uniform. I wasn't just a veteran. I was their general. And my family was speechless. I didn't join the army to make a name for myself. I joined to get out. Out of that house. Out of that town. Out of a family that celebrated silence more than truth. Where appearances mattered more than intentions, and rebellion of any kind was treated like treason. Clarice was the golden one. Everyone said so. She was elegant from the moment she could walk, spoke softly like a senator's daughter, and kept her shoes lined up by color and heel height. She memorized Dad's rules like scripture. She followed everyone. In return, he gave her his pride. Me, I was the shadow that kept moving. I climbed trees in my Sunday dress, questioned things too early, and refused to pretend I enjoyed the company of people who belittled me. I was the one who asked our mother why she never spoke during dinner, who asked my father why Clarice got applause for obeying while I got punishment for thinking. They called me difficult, hard-headed, unpredictable. I wore those words like scars, long before I knew what resilience was. When I told them I had enlisted in the army at 17, the reaction was almost amusing. Clarice blinked like she didn't understand the sentence. My mother looked at the floor. My father folded his newspaper and said, "Of course you did." He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just looked at me like I'd proven him right again. "You never could stay in line, Rihanna," he muttered. But what he didn't understand was that I wasn't running away from order. I was running toward it, toward a structure that rewarded clarity over charm, action over posture, truth over illusion. Basic training wasn't the hardest part. It was the first time I'd been allowed to fail without being shamed. The first time someone told me to stand up, not sit down, and stay quiet. I didn't miss home. I missed nothing about that place. Clarice sent a single postcard 2 years later, a photo of her and Dad at an officer's ball. She wrote, "Hope you're well. He doesn't ask about you. No signature." I kept it for some reason. Not out of sentiment, but because it reminded me of the exact person I was never going to become. By then I had already deployed once, learned how to give orders, learned what it meant to be depended on. I found my place not in recognition but in responsibility. I never told them where I was stationed. I never sent letters back. But I started writing to someone else. It started on a rainy night in Ramstein, Germany. I had just completed a strategic briefing when someone handed me a brown envelope, marked in my father's handwriting. I almost didn't open it. The letter was plain. No apology, no warmth. Just sentences laid out like bullet points. "Your mother says you're alive. Good. Clarice is getting promoted. Of course. The president came to Norfolk last week. I didn't go. Then this, Rihanna, you were never easy. But neither was I. You have a quality this family has never understood: integrity without need for applause." I read that line 3 times. It was the closest he ever came to saying he respected me. I didn't respond, but he wrote again. Not often, maybe 3 times a year. The letters were short and strangely specific. He would ask what kind of boots I wore. He once sent me a clipping about a woman pilot who broke altitude records. And every time at the bottom he signed off with, "No one knows what you're doing. But I hope it matters." I never showed those letters to anyone. They became my secret permission slip, a quiet acknowledgement that someone had finally seen me. Not entirely, not kindly, but clearly. And that was enough. During Operation Line Step, I kept the second-to-last letter folded in my left cargo pocket. We had to evacuate under blackout radio silent, carrying a wounded intel analyst through 6 miles of terrain with no air cover. I felt it pressing against my thigh the whole time, like a second heartbeat. When we got out, I unfolded it again. Read it while the others slept. Dirt under my nails, blood still on my vest. It said, "You were always the hardest to read. But that doesn't mean you weren't right." I wept that night, not because I wanted him back, but because something unspoken had finally been named. That letter, creased, weathered, written in shaky pen, now sits inside the inner lining of my duffel bag. I carry it still, not because I need to prove anything, but because it proves something was once real between us, however flawed. Clarice never knew about those letters. I doubt she ever will. To her, I'm still the failure, the embarrassment, the sister who pretended to be brave. But to me, that letter is a medal no ceremony ever awarded. It said everything they never had the courage to say aloud, and it reminded me of who I became, not despite my family, but because of how they tried to erase me. Family doesn't always turn on you with shouts or slam doors. Sometimes they do it with silence, with omissions, with quiet decisions made in rooms you were never invited into. Clarice didn't need to raise her voice to cut me out. She did it with the precision of a scalpel, quick, calculated, and clean. At least from the outside. When our mother passed away, I was at Fort Bragg finishing a field exercise. I'd been trying to get leave approved for her final days, but the paperwork kept getting delayed. I called Clarice every evening from the payphone outside the barracks, trying to stay updated. On the 4th night, the line went dead. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. I waited. Nothing. 3 days later, I learned through a forwarded email, not even addressed to me, that the funeral had taken place. Already done. Clarice never told me. Never gave me the date. When I confronted her months later, she shrugged. "We didn't know if you'd make it," she said. "Didn't want to get everyone's hopes up." Hopes up. Like my presence would have been a surprise, or worse, an inconvenience. It wasn't the only time. During my early years of service, I used to call home from different time zones, time permitting. Clarice was always the one who picked up. Our conversations rarely lasted more than 2 minutes. "How's the desert?" she once asked. "It's not a vacation, Clarice," I replied. She chuckled, then said, "Well, you chose it." Eventually, she stopped answering, or blocked the number, I don't know which. All I know is that I stopped trying after the 4th straight dial tone. Over the years, I was reduced to a nickname within the family, the one in the Army. That was it. No rank, no name, no face. Just a phrase they used when people asked where I was. "She's doing something with helicopters," I think Clarice told a family friend once, while I was standing 10 feet away home for the first time in 6 years. I had just completed a mission that pulled 6 operatives out of hostile territory. But to her, I was the girl who used to climb trees and make noise. The real fracture came the summer after my father's stroke. I returned home for 2 days unannounced. I needed to see him. We hadn't spoken in years, but I'd heard he was bedridden, that the fire in him had quieted. I walked into the house just before dinner. Clarice looked startled. My father blinked from his chair. He recognized me, but barely. His voice slurred. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come. Clarice didn't invite me to stay. She said, "We weren't expecting you. The guest room's being used." I said I'd sleep in the car. She didn't argue. That night, while everyone slept, I walked into the den, the room where we kept the family shrine. Photos of every generation. My grandfather in his navy whites. My mother in her wedding gown. Clarice as a debutante. Even cousins I'd never met frozen in golden frames. I looked for mine. I scanned the mantel, the wall, the lower shelves. Nothing. Not a single picture of me remained. The one that used to hang beside Clarice's graduation portrait, me in my dress uniform, age 22, first lieutenant, fresh out of ranger school, gone. I found the frame in the cabinet below. Face down, still with my nameplate etched in brass. Dust had settled over it like shame. Clarice never said they removed it. She didn't have to. That moment said everything. I wasn't just the outsider. I was the piece of the family they chose to erase. I stared at that empty shelf for a long time. Then I gently placed the frame back in the cabinet. I didn't take it with me. I wanted them to remember they'd buried someone alive. When I left the next morning, no one said goodbye. My father raised his hand slightly, like he was reaching for something in the air. Maybe a word, maybe a memory, or maybe finally me. I walked away before I could find out. The memorial service moved on without pause. I sat near the rear close enough to see everything far enough that they could pretend I wasn't there. They did. Clarice stood off to the side now, speaking with guests like a congresswoman at a fundraiser. Every movement rehearsed, every smile calculated. She knew exactly how much grief to show, just enough to seem dignified, never enough to appear undone. I kept my coat buttoned. My duffel bag rested at my feet, its weight familiar, anchoring me to the floor. It had been with me through more borders and battles than anyone in that room. But today it held something heavier than gear. It held the truth. Around me, family gathered in clusters, cousins, nephews, aunts I hadn't seen in 20 years. Most of them didn't recognize me. A few glanced, then looked away quickly, unsure if they should say something or let the past stay buried. I didn't force it. I wasn't there for reconciliation. I was there for my father. Behind me, 2 middle-aged cousins whispered over coffee. I thought she wasn't coming. She always does this. Shows up when it's dramatic. I heard she wasn't even in real combat. Clarice says she quit halfway through. Couldn't handle it. I didn't turn around. My ears were used to whispers. What caught me off guard was the child's voice that followed. Mom said Aunt Rihanna gave up. The words were small, high-pitched, uncertain. I turned my head slightly and saw her, a girl no older than 10, holding her mother's hand, looking confused. She had Clarice's chin and my father's eyes. Her mother didn't correct her. She simply nodded. Gave up. That phrase hung in the air like a verdict. I didn't flinch. I didn't interrupt. I just met the child's eyes and held her gaze longer than most adults ever dared. She didn't look away. Something in her expression shifted, like a question forming that she didn't know how to ask. Across the room, my younger brother Peter leaned toward a distant relative and said, "She hasn't spoken to Dad in years. Not since she stormed out that summer. Stormed out." They rewrote my life like they were recounting a movie they barely watched. Took fragments and folded them into fiction. Their version was cleaner, easier, less heroic, less uncomfortable. I was the chapter they'd agreed to skip. My niece, a teenager in a pale blue dress, turned to her boyfriend and whispered, "I heard she never finished boot camp. That she faked her uniform for a photo once." She giggled. He smirked. I looked at her face. I remembered the day she was born, how I had flown back in secret just to watch her through the hospital glass, because Clarice said my presence would make everyone tense. She didn't even know I had been there. I thought about standing up, about walking across the room, opening the bag, and laying down every medal, every citation, every fragment of proof. But not yet. It wasn't the moment. Not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that truth hits harder when it's not shouted. Let them circle, let them speculate, let them underestimate. I took a slow breath and adjusted my posture. Not defensive, not proud, just present. I didn't speak, but my eyes, they did not look away. They did not blink. And that was the beginning of the end for their version of the story. Because silence, when held with strength, becomes unbearable to liars. And soon, it would be their turn to go quiet. Clarice waited until the room was just quiet enough for her voice to matter. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. Her tone did all the lifting, smooth, performative, confident in its cruelty. "If you're really who you say you are," she said, turning to face me fully, "then why don't you prove it?" The murmur stopped. Cups of coffee were lowered. Chairs shifted slightly. She gestured toward my bag, the same worn duffel that had followed me through 3 continents and 30 years of service. "Go ahead," she added with a shrug. "Let everyone see what you've been holding so close. Unless there's nothing in there worth seeing." There it was. The moment she had been maneuvering toward since the ceremony began. She wasn't just trying to expose me. She was betting on spectacle. That I would be caught bluffing in front of strangers and blood alike. That the shame of it would finally seal me into silence for good. I looked at her, then at the crowd. Their faces told me everything. They weren't curious. They were expectant. They didn't believe me, but more than disbelief, they were eager to be entertained by a collapse. No one moved to stop her. Even those who looked uncomfortable, Clarice's husband, an old neighbor, my own cousin Paul, they said nothing. Because silence is safe. Silence sides with whoever is loudest, and Clarice had always been loudest without ever shouting. I reached down and picked up the bag. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't racing. I'd faced down warlords. I'd negotiated hostage releases under threat of sniper fire. What stood in front of me now wasn't danger. It was decay. The slow, corrosive rot of a family that had forgotten how to honor what didn't resemble them. I placed the bag on the table beside the flower arrangements and urn. My father's urn. I didn't come here to explain myself. I said, my voice low but clear. I came to honor him. But since you're so concerned about truth, let's start there. I unzipped the bag. First came the notebook. Black scuffed leather edges, worn corners frayed. Inside deployment records, handwritten strategies, code names, long decommissioned. I placed it gently on the table. Next, a coin. A challenge coin given only by direct hand of command. The emblem was faded, but the weight was unmistakable. I let it rest next to the notebook. Then a small velvet pouch. Inside, dog tags. Not mine. 3 names, all lost during Operation Greentide. Their families had never claimed them. I carried them still, for memory, for weight. A silver compass followed. The inscription on the back was barely legible, etched in dust and time. To RD, for when true north feels far. My hand paused over the last item. Around the room, breath was held. You could feel the tension shift. Less amusement now, more discomfort. Clarice folded her arms. This doesn't prove anything. I met her gaze. It does to the people who matter. Finally, I pulled out the last object. A folded military dress uniform. Deep blue, pressed, crisp. 4 stars on the shoulder boards. The insignia of a general of the United States Army. There was a ripple in the room, an exhale of disbelief or awe, or both. I didn't unfold it. I didn't need to. The presence of it alone filled the space. One man in uniform stood. Then another. Slowly, without a word, more followed. 10, 20, 50, 100. They stood not because I asked them to, not because they knew my name, but because they knew the truth when it walked into a room and refused to kneel. Clarice took a half step back. Her lips parted, but no words came. I gently set the uniform down. Every piece I had laid out on that table wasn't just a relic. It was a map, a story, a record they had never cared to ask for, unfolded in front of them now, undeniable. This wasn't theater, it was testimony. And the room had no choice but to listen. Clarice's silence didn't last long. It never did. She laughed, short, sharp, artificial. A single syllable meant to shatter the weight in the room. "Oh, come on," she said, looking around at the guests like she was inviting them into a joke. "You don't actually believe this, do you?" No one replied. She took a step closer to the table, her eyes on the uniform like it was a stage prop. Her fingers hovered just above it, careful not to touch. "This is custom, right?" she continued, voice lighter now. "You can get anything made online these days. I mean 4 stars. That's a bit much even for you." She looked around again, searching for anyone to laugh with her. Her husband stared at the floor. Her daughter bit her lip. Even the family friend who always backed her was now silent. The room had shifted and Clarice felt it. But she didn't know how to retreat. So she turned back to me, arms crossed, smirk forced into place. "You expect us to believe you just showed up with a perfect uniform and a story, and now we're all supposed to applaud?" Before I could speak, a voice came from the back of the room. "No one's applauding," the man said. "We're standing. That's different." The voice was deep, calm, familiar in a way that reached somewhere I hadn't touched in decades. I turned toward it. He stepped forward slowly, parting the crowd without effort. Full army dress uniform, his medals shimmered beneath the overhead lights. His posture was perfect, like it had always been. I knew him before he said another word. "I know that uniform," he said, eyes locked on mine. "And I know the woman who wore it." Clarice's smirk faltered. "Who are you?" she asked. The man ignored her completely. He stopped 2 feet from me and saluted. I returned it slowly, deliberately. Then he offered his hand. "I'm Command Sergeant Major David Rios," he said. "Retired now, but 34 years ago I was a private first class in Joint Task Unit Echo. Northern Border Operations. Operation Midas Fall." A few heads in the room nodded slowly, recognizing the name, just barely. She was our CO, Rios said, turning to face the others. Captain Riona Drexmar back then. The mission went bad, communications down, terrain hostile. We were green, nervous, and she kept us alive. He looked directly at Clarice. I was 19, scared out of my damn mind. But I remember one thing clearer than anything else from that deployment. He turned back to me. Your eyes. The room held still. You didn't scream, you didn't flinch. You looked every one of us dead in the eye even when bullets were coming down like rain. And in that moment we knew every single one of us that you would get us out. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat tightened, but I kept my face calm. I owe you more than I ever said, Rios added. So when I saw the name on that uniform just now, I stood. And I'll stand again if I have to. Clarice swallowed hard. You're telling me she's a general. She's more than that, Rios replied. She's the reason I came home. A long pause followed. The kind of pause that reveals everything. Who speaks, who doesn't, who changes, who never will. I stepped forward, picked up the uniform, and folded it with practiced care. I don't need you to believe it, I said softly. It exists whether you do or not. Clarice opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. And this time she finally understood what it felt like to be on the outside of the story. Not forgotten, just irrelevant. Clarice wasn't done. Even after Sergeant Major Rios's words had settled over the room like a silence nobody wanted to break, she stepped forward again, back straight chin. Lifted voice, dipped in that familiar blend of superiority and disbelief. Well, that's quite the story, she said, lips tight. Very cinematic. She turned to the crowd as if seeking confirmation. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but didn't meet her gaze. But if she really is who she claims to be, she continued louder. Now where's the record? Where's the proof? I looked her up last year. There's nothing. No online file, no news articles, not even a mention in the registry of high-ranking army officers. You can't just become a general and vanish from history. The words hit like an accusation, pointed and cold. Clarice didn't want clarification. She wanted to reclaim the room. To remind everyone she still held the microphone, even if she'd lost the moment. I looked at her not with anger, but with something far sharper clarity. You're right, I said. There is no file. A new ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Clarice blinked. She hadn't expected that. I don't appear on public lists. Not in press briefings. Not in recruitment posters. You won't find a single photo of me shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense or cutting a ribbon at a base ceremony. I stepped closer to the front, keeping my voice even controlled. Because the places I served didn't exist, not officially. The units I commanded weren't named. The operations we ran were never acknowledged. And the people I lost, many of them, are still listed as missing or dead from unrelated causes. A heavy pause. Because that's what it means to work in shadow, Clarice scoffed. Convenient excuse. I ignored her. The Army has units designed for discretion. Entire careers built behind veils. Not because we're more important, but because the consequences of being known were too great. There are missions that never make it to the front page. Wars that never receive declarations. And medals that were earned, but never awarded. At that, I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved a slim folder. It was marked with a declassification stamp dated less than 3 weeks prior. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the table next to the folded uniform. The first page bore my full name, my rank, my serial number, my assignments, most of them redacted, but the heading was unmistakable: Department of Defense, Special Projects Division, Status Clearance Alpha 1, Service Record confirmed. Clarice leaned in to read, eyes scanning with urgency. Her face paled. Beside it, I laid down a certificate unsigned dated 10 years ago. At the top, embossed in gold, were the words, Medal of Honor nomination, withheld pending review. There had never been a review. The mission it referred to hadn't been acknowledged until last month. For 10 years it had lived in silence, like I had. I was never supposed to carry this, I said, quietly placing my fingers over the document. But when the files were declassified this spring, they sent it to me. Said it was overdue. Clarice's mouth opened, then closed again. No sound came. Some records take time to surface, I continued. Some truths can't be Googled. And some people, believe it or not, do the hardest work with no need for applause. The air grew still. Even the children in the room had gone silent. I didn't show up here to demand attention, I said. I came to say goodbye to my father, but you forced my hand. Clarice stood frozen, the paper inches from her face, the 4 stars on my uniform, gleaming just enough to remind her that she had never known who she was speaking to. And now she did. The room was so quiet I could hear the wind tapping softly against the memorial windows. Clarice remained frozen, her hand still hovering over the declassified documents. Behind her, my folded uniform with its crisp 4 stars lay in silent judgment on the velvet-draped table. That's when I saw him. General Crane stepped forward from the back of the hall, his posture still upright despite the weight of age and a dozen scars of service. I hadn't even noticed his arrival, but now, as he walked with firm purpose, the rows of uniformed soldiers instinctively parted to let him through. He stopped just beside me, eyes scanning the documents, then looked out across the audience. And then in a voice both formal and full of something deeper, almost reverent, he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I know this is a day to remember Admiral Drexmar, but before we continue, I believe there is someone else we must recognize today. Someone whose service has remained in the shadows far too long." He turned to face the crowd more fully. "I stand here not just as a fellow soldier, but as someone who once served under her command. A command I wasn't allowed to talk about. A team that didn't exist, at least not on paper." The crowd began to shift their curiosity, visibly deepening. General Crane gestured toward me. I was a second lieutenant then, young, impulsive, half-trained. And I was assigned to a unit I wasn't allowed to name. We answered only to one person, an officer whose presence could still a battlefield with a single look. We called her Ghostfire. Gasps rippled around the room. She was the only woman on that team, he continued. And the only one who never raised her voice yet, always got obedience. She led us across enemy lines in frozen mountains and scorched deserts during missions that, if we failed, would never be spoken of again. He turned his eyes on me, and though decades had passed since we stood shoulder to shoulder, I could feel the weight of those memories in his gaze. "I owe her my life," he said, "and I owe her my conscience, because I would not be standing here if not for her decisions in that forest near Varna, during a mission none of you will find in any history book." People were no longer just watching. They were listening now. Some had even stood up. General Crane raised his voice slightly. "Today we remember Admiral Drexmar for his service to the Navy. But I ask you all, no, I urge you to also honor the service of his daughter, General Rihanna Drexmar, who gave more to this nation than many who've worn medals in parades." Clarice's eyes were glassy. She blinked furiously, as if trying to reset the narrative, but the room had turned. The very space had shifted. "We were never supposed to know," Crane added, softening. "But the truth has a way of surfacing. We honor General Drexmar not for fame, not for recognition, but because every soldier here knows what it means to serve without applause." At that moment, a murmur spread through the soldiers standing in the back rows. One by one, they stepped forward, silently, uniforms sharp, medals glinting. And then, as if on cue, one voice called out, "Present arms." 100 soldiers, men and women, young and old, snapped into a full salute. All eyes were on me, and for the first time in my life, I allowed them to be. The salute held like a still photograph, firm, quiet, and undeniable. Then slowly, like sunlight breaking over a forgotten valley, the silence began to melt. It started with the sound of a single hand clapping, then another and another, until the entire back row of civilians, friends of my father, guests from the base, retired officers, stood in a swelling chorus of applause. But not my family. My brother kept his hands folded. My mother's second husband stared straight ahead, blinking like he'd lost his place in a book. Clarice sat stiff in her chair, jaw clenched, hands tight around her purse. She looked up at me, eyes wet, but not with remorse. Just pride wounded beyond repair. She leaned forward slightly, barely audible beneath the growing cheers. "You fooled them all," she whispered. "Even Dad." It didn't sting the way she hoped it would, because I didn't flinch, I didn't argue, and I didn't look away. Instead, I met her words with a silence she had never been able to understand, one forged not from fear, but from clarity. Because I had stopped needing her recognition a long time ago. That's when I heard another voice, a younger one. "Excuse me," someone said from the second row. A young man stood, maybe 25, slender, civilian suit but a military-style posture. He held something in his hands, a folded cap, perhaps his father's. "My name is Darius Novak," he said loud enough to quiet the applause. "My father served in a classified unit during the Cold War. He never told us much. But he once mentioned a woman, an officer, who didn't carry rank on her sleeve because she didn't need to." All heads turned to him. He said she never raised her voice, never took credit, never waited to be praised. She just showed up when the mission required it and disappeared when it was done. He glanced around, visibly emotional. Then his eyes landed on me. "He never told us her name. Only said that if you were lucky enough to serve under her, you came back changed. Because she didn't need to be known to do what was right." I felt my breath catch. Not because of the words, but because of how he was holding his father's cap. There, faint but unmistakable, was a small stitch along the inner lining. A mark I'd made with thread during one of our winter missions when his father's hat had torn and supplies were scarce. I remembered that day. I remembered the frostbite. I remembered the way his father had insisted on finishing the perimeter walk, even when his leg was bleeding. I remembered thinking, these are the men I serve for. I nodded at Darius. "Your father," I said gently, "was the kind of soldier who made others braver just by standing beside them." He blinked, fast swallowed emotion. "He said the same thing about you," he replied. Behind him, more faces shifted. Some leaned forward, some looked at Clarice. Others just watched me as if trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of them with the ghost of stories they'd only half believed. Clarice shrank further into her seat. Her power, the one she'd curated for decades through implication, gossip, and omission, was slipping. And for the first time I realized she wasn't angry anymore. She was afraid, because she knew the truth wasn't mine alone anymore. It had become shared. It had become real, and it had witnesses. As Darius sat down, the air seemed different. Lighter but not soft, just clearer. Like smoke had finally lifted, revealing faces that had always been there, just blurred by distance, memory, or design. Clarice didn't say another word. Her mouth tightened. She stared straight ahead, maybe at the flag, maybe at the marble bust of our father, but her shoulders slumped slightly, not in defeat but in resignation. There would be no more fight in her, not today. Then I felt a hand brush against mine. I looked down. A girl, no older than 10. Chestnut hair, freckles, a dress with tiny daisies. She had Clarice's eyes, but not her fear. She was crying, not sobbing. Just 2 clean streams running silently down her cheeks. She held a crumpled tissue in one hand, the other still touching mine. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely more than a breath. "Mom said things that weren't true. She said you left. She said you didn't care." She swallowed hard. "But I know that's not right." For a moment I froze, not because I didn't believe her, but because I wasn't sure what this moment needed. I could have said something comforting. I could have told her that it wasn't her fault, that families are complicated, that grown-ups sometimes lie to protect themselves. But none of that would have meant anything to her, not now. So instead I did the only thing that mattered. I nodded. One slow, deliberate nod. Her face changed. Not with relief, she was too young to carry guilt, but with recognition. She understood somehow that silence could be a kindness too. She squeezed my fingers once, then let go and walked back to her seat. And I stood there, no podium, no medal in hand, no speech prepared, just a woman in front of her father's urn with a duffel bag emptied at her feet, and her name finally spoken with truth. Not everyone clapped again. Some remained unsure. Some wrestled with their shame or pride or plain disbelief. But none of that mattered, because I had never needed applause, not to serve, not to survive, not to remember. But today what I received was something I had never allowed myself to hope for, the truth, not whispered, not hidden in letters, but said aloud and heard. That was the only decoration I'd ever wanted, and it was finally mine. After the ceremony, I didn't stay long. The chatter resumed, though more hushed now. Some people nodded at me respectfully. Some avoided my gaze, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of awe. A few reached out, shook my hand. I accepted every gesture, quietly offering only the softest thank you. But I knew my presence no longer demanded explanation. That was enough. A small podium had been set up under the archway near the memorial wall. Someone from the Veterans Council approached me with a clipboard. A smile too wide. General Drexmar, we'd be honored if you'd say a few words. Everyone would love to hear from you. I looked past him. My duffel bag was still there, zipped now, leaning against the marble. The folded uniform inside had already spoken louder than I ever could. I appreciate the invitation, I said calmly. But no. He blinked, caught off guard. Ma'am. No speeches, I said. Not today. There was a murmur among the crowd. Some seemed confused. Others disappointed. A few nodded as though they understood because maybe they did. Instead, I walked up to the table where the guest book lay. Right beside it was a brass stand meant for floral tributes or framed photographs. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the original letter. My father's handwriting had faded over time, the corners yellowed, the creases deepened from being folded and refolded too many times. But the ink still held, and so did the weight of every word. I placed it gently into the glass display frame they'd used earlier for his service medals. With care, I set it upright so anyone walking past could read. On the bottom of the letter, written in my father's steady hand, were words that had never left me since the day I received them. If you ever choose silence, let this letter speak for you. I stepped back, and I let it speak. Not for my accolades, not for my rank, not for vengeance, but for everything we had shared, me and the man who once called me stubborn, then learned to call me brave. Clarice stood at a distance, arms crossed, unreadable. I didn't walk toward her, and she didn't approach me. We had said what needed to be said without speaking. People would read the letter. Some would nod, some would scoff, but it didn't matter, because my story didn't belong to them. It never had. It belonged to me, and to the silence that bore truth more powerful than any applause. When I turned to leave, the sun was high. My boots stepped forward, not toward a stage or a spotlight, but down the path behind the memorial garden where no one followed, where no one needed to. Because for the first time in my life, I was walking away, not to escape, but to arrive. The applause continued behind me, a rhythmic tide of hands meeting hands, but it no longer reached me. I walked steadily across the courtyard, past rows of white chairs, now half empty, through the archway that separated memory from motion. My steps were not rushed nor ceremonious. They simply belonged to someone who had stayed long enough. The leaves rustled, gently stirred by a wind that didn't ask for permission. I didn't look back, but I knew exactly where she stood. Clarice, she hadn't moved much. From the corner of my eye, I sensed her posture, upright, arms crossed, no longer hands lowered to her sides. The tilt of her shoulders had changed, and so had the look on her face. For the first time in our lives, she wasn't looking at me with contempt. There was no sneer, no smirk, no feigned indifference. Just stillness. I didn't need to see it. I could feel it. That small, trembling shift when someone's view of the world finally cracks, when a story they've told themselves for decades no longer fits. Her silence now said more than her jabs ever had. Maybe she would find words for it later. Maybe not. But that wasn't my concern anymore. As I passed the last row of hedges, I remembered a time when I might have waited. Waited for her to call out, to apologize, to beg forgiveness, to offer explanation or remorse, or even a thank you. But those expectations had long since withered. What mattered now wasn't what she would do. What mattered was that I had done what I came to do. I had come to honor my father. I had come to reclaim the truth, not to shout it, not to brandish it, but to hold it steady and let it breathe, let it be seen. And I had done that. My boots touched gravel now, softer ground under fir trees. A few more steps, and the music of the ceremony faded behind the stone wall. The world outside was quieter, not hollow, just calm. Free. A bird darted overhead. A child's laugh echoed faintly from a different section of the cemetery. Life continued. Somewhere behind me, Clarice still stood. I didn't turn to confirm it, but I knew her gaze followed me, not as a sister doubting a fraud, but as a woman facing a truth she had never allowed herself to believe. I wasn't a shadow in the corner of our family's story anymore. I was the page she never wanted to read, and now even she couldn't unsee the words. Still, I didn't seek comfort in that. I didn't want vindication or regret. I only wanted what I had earned, the right to walk away whole. To leave not because I had no place, but because I had finally claimed it. And so I walked on, silent, steady, and unseen by most, but not forgotten, never again forgotten.